Hi. So we're going to start our discussion of the other sensory systems by talking about hearing. Now, when I was an undergraduate and I was taking a sensation and perception course, I fell in love when I realized that there were more probable answers to two really fascinating questions, right? So one of them was, um, why is the sky blue, right? So, you know, as a child, when I asked adults without training those types of questions, I would hear, um, well, I don't think it was adults who answered this way, but anyway, the um, most common answer would be that the sky is just a reflection of the ocean. Well, why is the ocean blue? Well, it's just a reflection of the sky. And it's like, well, that's not really an answer. And if something appears blue, now we understand that what is happening is that there is more firing in the cone that's sensitive to shorter wavelengths of light. And actually, the phenomenon is called Rayleigh scattering. So there's particles in the air, in the atmosphere, and it scatters the rays of sunlight. And what predominantly reaches the eye are the shorter wavelengths. So that's the blue hue to our sky. And for hearing, another question was, if a tree falls in the middle of the woods and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Right? And, if nobody's there, we can't have an adequate answer to that. Well, I should say like a 100% confident answer to that question. But I think what this question does is nicely exemplifies the difference between these concepts of sensation and perception. And so if I had to answer this question, my vote would be no, right? When we talk about a sound is a perceptual phenomenon, right? So I wouldn't argue that the tree doesn't produce waves, but a sound takes a sense organ to detect, and it is an outcome of that detection. So when I use the term sensation, what I'm saying is it's a detection of a physical stimulus. And if you remember with vision, we are only sensitive to a sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum, and there are other species that can perceive wider bands of that spectrum than we can. It's very similar with hearing. We are sensitive to a particular frequency of sounds, and again, that's how our organs, our sensory organs, in this case, our ears and the anatomy of the ear, which we'll talk about in a moment, evolved to detect physical stimuli, right? Some wavelength and amplitude stimulus in the environment. And so in order to actually detect something, our sensory receptors need to be stimulated. And perception is the interpretation. It's the making that sensory information meaningful, or the processing, organizing, and interpreting of sensory information. And again, our receptors, and sensory receptors are specific to a certain type of energy. They are going to transduce or transform that information into the energy out in the environment to patterns of neuronal firing. So again, it's the intensity and pattern of information that makes it meaningful. It's our nervous system decoding the patterns of neural responses to make this information meaningful. So again, receptors are specialized neurons and they respond to a particular form of energy. So for vision, it was electromagnetic energy in a particular, that has a particular wavelength. Again, wavelengths measured in nanometers. Well, the sensory receptors for hearing are sensitive to a different type of energy. The quality or characteristics of that energy is still going to have a wave. It's sound waves or periodic compressions of air or other kinds of media. And that's going to produce a wave that has a length and a height. And those characteristics are going to inform something about the sound based on its qualities. So hearing versus listening. Again, the detection of a stimulus in a particular form, the appropriate or adequate stimulus. Light waves for vision, sound waves for hearing. That detection is the sensation. Did we acquire any information from the environment? And perception is then the interpretation of that information or the making meaningful. Now, the sensory receptors for audition or for hearing are called hair cells, and these are microscopic images of hair cells from frogs, but our hair cells are actually quite similar, and they line the basilar membrane in our inner ear, but we'll get to that in a moment. And when these are bent, they are stimulated in a particular pattern, and that's going to produce sound. So again, the stimulus for hearing is the detection of sound waves, which are periodic compressions of air, water, and other media. And these waves have characteristics, and they vary in their amplitude and their frequency, or their height and the timing of their response. Okay. So the amplitude of a sound wave is going to inform the loudness of that sound. So the higher the height, the higher the amplitude, the louder the sound. The shorter the amplitude, the softer the sound. Okay. Frequency, the number of wave cycles, is very similar to length for vision. Low frequency waves are going to be perceived as having a lower pitch, whereas these higher frequency waves are going to be perceived as a higher pitch. And then timbre or complexity has to do with whether or not there's pure tones or if there's complex tones. So again, frequency is the wavelength of a sound wave. It's measured in hertz. Human hearing ranges from 20 to 20,000 hertz. And again, just like vision wavelengths in vision, there are some that are below our ability to perceive and some above that ability to perceive. So there are infrasound frequencies below the range of human hearing, and ultrasound, which is stimuli with frequencies on the upper, above the range of human hearing. And again, different species have different ranges of auditory information they're sensitive to. And this sensitivity is in relation to our evolution. we evolved sense detectors to get information from the environment that was biologically relevant for us. And again, that's going to be different for different species. Now, there is some information here about at what decibel can we experience pain or permanent damage. And I added this chart because I thought it was pretty neat to read what the decibels of sound are for these common happenings. And again, 130 decibels is the threshold of pain, which is about the sound of a machine gun fire. And then we have above that jets, and at 160 decibels, you have instant perforation of the eardrum. It'll rupture and doesn't sound fun. So, okay. Now, what's really interesting about human hearing is the level at which we are maximally sensitive, and that level is where human speech lives, right? So it's also pretty interesting, and it's not on the slides, and I don't think it's in your book either, but we're actually, not only is human speech in our most sensitive range of frequencies, but so are bird calls. And I was reading a post on a neuroscience news feed the other day, probably sometime last semester actually, and they said that being nomadic and traveling and searching for resources, the ability to hear bird calls would alert our species of where possible resources were, like food and water. So we have a range of hearing sensitive to bird song, so that we could travel and make sure that there were resources along the way of our travels, which I think is pretty cool, if that's true. It seems so, but it's hard to say. Children hear higher frequencies than adults do. The ability to recognize high frequencies diminish with age and exposure to loud noises. Please protect your ears when you go to concerts. If you do damage your hair cells, your auditory receptors, they do not regenerate. And I don't know if anybody's experienced like the tinnitus, that ringing in the ears. That's potential damage to your hair cells, leaving loud concerts. Very cool. And some research I'd like to do at some point is this ability to communicate emotion through sound of the voice, but also this is related to how music can communicate emotion as well. And there was a pretty cool study done by a prior mentor of mine where actually there's a relationship between the sound of music and emotions, and also to color. So music that communicates sadness based on the pitch and timbre is also correlated to colors. So colors like gray are associated with sadness, and yellow is for happiness. And yellow goes along with higher pitched or higher frequency sounds. That's cool. Okay, so let's talk about the anatomy of the ear, okay? The outer ear, that part that Van Gogh just right off, is called the pinna. So the pinna is not necessary for hearing. What this, the pinna, what this flesh and cartilage attached to the side of your head does is that it helps reflect sound waves into the middle ear from the outer ear. And it's also going to help us locate the source of sound. So without the pinna, you're just might not hear certain sounds. It's going to be harder to tell where a sound comes from, but you are not going to be deaf, for instance. We have an external auditory canal, and that allows sound to enter the skull cavity. So through the canal to the middle ear, we have the tympanic membrane. It's also called the eardrum. And so the eardrum is going to vibrate at the same rate as the wave that struck it. So the pinna funnels the sound wave into the canal. It has a particular frequency, and it's going to strike the eardrum and have the eardrum vibrate at that frequency. That vibration is going to move these three tiny bones called ossicles, and they're going to transform the waves into stronger waves. And the stronger waves are going to amplify that sound wave. It's going to move through the oval window where we have the cochlea, and there's fluid in this area of the inner ear. And the cochlea is where the sensory receptors are for healing. They line the basilar membrane. They line the basilar membrane, and the tectoral membrane sits kind of on top of it. And when sound waves come in and the oval window vibrates and it pushes fluid over the hair, the membranes, and it'll bend the hair cells. And the bending of those hair cells is what stimulates those receptors, and those receptors are going to send information to the auditory nerve. Okay. So once it goes to the auditory nerve, that information is going to be sent or processed contralaterally, just like other sensory information does. And there is a relationship, or a similarity, I should say, in the pathway of processing visual information that there is for auditory information. So from the auditory nerve, that information is sent to the primary auditory cortex, which is area V1. So for vision, went from the optic nerve to area V1, primary processing area for vision. So here, it's the auditory nerve to the primary auditory cortex. Through that pathway is actually connection with the thalamus. So auditory nerve, thalamus, the medial geniculate nucleus, and then to area A1 for primary processing. And again, each hemisphere receives most of its information from the opposite ear. So again, organization is parallel to that of the visual cortex. There's a superior temporal cortex that has area MT, which allows for the detection of motion of sound. Let's see. The auditory system has a what and where pathways. There are areas that respond to, again, identifying sound. What is that sound? There's areas that are specialized to process machine noises and animal noises and things of that nature. So again, we have these two separate streams. The dorsal goes to the parietal lobe, where that sound is coming from. So it's important for localizing sound and directing eye movements. The ventral stream is what that sound is. Right. And again, animal cries, machine noises, music, etc. Those have to be identified. Again, that's biologically relevant information. Even the distinction between an animal cry and a human cry is important information. Okay, so this figure right here gives you a pathway of auditory information. So again, process contralaterally. We have signals from the ears going to the auditory nerve. Some of that information is going to be sent to other areas. But then we go to the medial geniculate nucleus, which is in the thalamus, and then that information is sent to the auditory cortex. Very similar to vision. And again, the primary processing area for vision is called area V1. Both have these different streams for different functions. And both systems have an area that is specialized for processing movement. One visual movement, one sound, motion and sound. Okay, so further areas of the cortex is necessary for processing advanced hearing. Damage to A1 does not cause deafness necessarily. It's usually, just like vision, the issue is usually at the level of the receptors, or it is further along in processing of auditory information. So just like, color blindness was area V4, there's going to be damage further on in the processing for audition in order to experience those types of issues. Now, we didn't talk about this in the vision chapter, but we have maps of sensory information in the cortex. And so the primary areas for audition and for vision have maps. For vision, it was a retinotopic map. So it's just a map of the retina. And we talked about the homunculus, which is the map of sensory information for the body, somatosensory cortex. The visual system and the auditory system have something very similar. The space, the cortical space, the area, the amount of cells that process certain types of information inform the sensitivity to that information. So, for example, the visual system, there's more cortical space in area V1 to process information that comes in from the fovea. That's where your detailed vision is. It's called cortical magnification. That's just more area to process foveal information. Well, for audition, we have tonotopic maps. And again, we have more or less space dedicated to processing information in the world, which means that we're more or less sensitive to it. So that range of frequencies that humans are most sensitive to, we have more cortical space in area V1 dedicated to processing those frequencies. And similar frequencies are processed in areas next to one another. So it is really just a map of processing sensory information. Okay, I want to go back a couple slides, and I want to talk about how we hear pitch. Our understanding of pitch perception is not as clear as color perception, for instance. So there are two primary theories that attempt to explain our ability to hear certain frequencies. And again, frequency informs pitch. So place theory. So each area along the basilar membrane, it's where those hair cells are sensitive to only specific frequencies of sound. So if we look at this figure, this is the basilar membrane in the human cochlea, okay, or again, the organ that detects sound waves. And so if you look at this, this is showing that different areas of the basilar membrane are fixed to process certain hertz sound waves, okay, certain lengths of sound waves. And so depending on where the hair cells are that are stimulated will inform pitch. Now, high frequency sounds are best explained by place theory, but it doesn't do a great job of explaining lower frequency sounds. The frequency theory does a better job of doing that. However, neither of them seem to do an adequate job singularly. The frequency theory states that the membrane is going to vibrate in synchrony with the sound wave. So again, remember, you know, there's vibration of the eardrum, which activates those bones, which are attached to the oval window, and it intensifies the vibration, and it moves this fluid inside the cochlea. And frequency theory is arguing that the basilar membrane is going to vibrate at the same frequency as the sound wave does. And place theory is going to argue that hair cells in particular areas are going to inform pitch. And it seems to be that we need a combination of both pitch theories to be able to even get at some access of how we perceive sound at all the levels of pitch that humans can. The Volley principle argues that the auditory nerve is also involved in a way that it produces volleys of impulses. And so, again, it's just like with vision, right? It's the combination of firing among multiple cells and no individual axon being able to produce particular frequencies. So you need a combination of these neuronal responses to be able to code for these pitches, and that the auditory nerve sends these as volleys of impulses, and so it creates certain patterns or timings of responses for us to be able to hear pitch. People vary in their sensitivity to pitch. Amusia the impaired detection of frequency changes, so tone deaf. And there are folks who have what's called absolute pitch or perfect pitch. They can hear a note and identify it. This seems to be a genetic predisposition, and also has a relationship to early and extensive musical training. And again, you know, these things inform one another. If somebody has an ease or a propensity towards involvement in particular activities and stimuli, that's going to inform their desire to want to be engaged with that early and to train extensively. There is research that shows that artists actually have a finer tuned visual system. And the question becomes, like, is that an outcome or a consequence of all the training, or did they have differences in the structure of the visual system prior to any training? And the answer is probably both. Probably that, you know, along with other, you know, behavioral proclivities, so that they would want to engage in these activities. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about sound localization. So primarily how we localize sound is through the timing of the sound reaching both ears, and whether or not these sound waves are in phase or in synchrony with one another when they reach the ears. Okay. So if a sound is coming from right in front of you, that wave is going to hit both ears at the same time. And there isn't going to be any part of your physicality that dampers that sound wave. So if a sound wave is coming from behind, if a sound is coming from behind you, your head is going to create a sound shadow, and it's going to tamper the sound waves before they reach your ears. And depending on how your head is turned and where behind you it comes from, it's going to influence the timing it reaches your ears and what phase it's in. So a sound shadow is just the tampering of a sound wave based on what that sound wave has to move through or around in order to I should say move through in order to reach your ears. Even if a sound is coming from, you know, in front of you, if it's located a little bit off to the side, it's going to reach your right ear before it meets your left ear. So it'll stimulate one ear before the other. And those sound waves are going to be out of phase with one another. So again, that's how we localize sound. And the pinna is going to help that sound get funneled into the inner ear, the canal. Okay, and lastly, I want to talk about hearing loss. There are two categories: the conductive or middle ear deafness, and then there is nerve deafness or inner ear deafness. Conductive middle ear deafness occurs if the bones in the middle ear fail to transmit sound waves properly to the cochlea. It's caused by disease, infections, or tumorous bone growths. It can be corrected by surgery or hearing aids that are going to amplify that sound. Sorry about that. Nerve or inner ear deafness is damage to the cochlea or to the hair cells or to the auditory nerves. And although it can be vary in degree, and confined to one part of the cochlea, this type of nerve or inner ear deafness at this point cannot be helped by hearing aids. Hearing aids are for middle ear damage as opposed to the nerve damage. Again, we've talked about this before, even though there's a level of plasticity in the central nervous system, new neurons only regenerate in the hippocampus and the olfactory system, as we know so far. So this nerve damage, or the inner ear damage to the hair cells or the cochlea, cannot be repaired. So that's our lecture in hearing. Stay tuned when we discuss the other sensory systems next time. I hope everybody's doing well, and see you for the review.